begin with deliberations on the climate-friendly and equitable communities parking code amendments. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to this meeting format that I need to take care of first. Anyone wishing to join the meeting online can do so by following the instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or on Comcast channel 21. For those who are joining us via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. For our main agenda item, I'd like to turn it over to Reed Werner to begin the staff presentation. And following the staff presentation, the commission will have the opportunity to ask questions and begin deliberations. Good, sir.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Reed Werner, and I'm the Land Use Supervisor with Building and Permit Services. With me tonight is Lydia Bishop, BPS Division Manager. We're here for deliberations and possible action on the Climate-Friendly and Equitable Communities, or CFEC, Parking Reform Land Use Code Amendments. Here's our agenda for tonight's presentation. We're going to start with a quick background and process update on the state's rule changes. Next, we'll provide a reminder of the public involvement activities associated with the CFEC Parking Reform Project. We'll then discuss a summary of the draft land use code amendments. Finally, we'll outline the next steps in the code amendment process and answer any questions that you have about the code amendments or other agenda materials. The first CFEC changes kicked in automatically at the end of last year. The state rules reduced minimum parking requirements for some uses and mandated that the city not require off-street parking for properties located within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors. The state rules also identified a list of specific uses that are exempt from minimum parking requirements, including childcare facilities, affordable housing developments, and dwelling units smaller than 750 square feet. The new electric vehicle charging capacity rules took effect after March 31st, and those rules require that new parking spaces built for developments with 5 or more dwelling units provide EV charging conduit to 40% of parking spaces built. These requirements are included in the land use code amendments, which we'll cover later in the presentation. By the end of this year, the city is required to adopt the code amendments that implement the rest of the parking reforms by choosing one of 3 options and implementing other parking reform regulations depending on the option chosen. The proposed land use code amendment implements option 1, which removes minimum parking requirements citywide. A reminder that this does not preclude the Planning Commission from recommending a different option or the City Council from adopting a different option. However, in addition to being the most straightforward to draft and implement and being the most equitable citywide, most stakeholders and survey respondents expressed a preference for this option. As you know, staff submitted and received a 6-month timeline extension from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, specifically to provide additional time to engage with the public on the parking reform project. The focus of the outreach was on centering the voices of historically marginalized community groups and distributing information broadly across the community. The city hosted individual stakeholder interviews, small group conversations, discussions with people at 2 tabling events, a virtual information session, and collected almost 440 online survey responses. Involvement included proactive outreach to communities of color, the LGBTQ+ community, Spanish-speaking residents, people experiencing disabilities, neighborhood groups, and folks working in affordable housing, transportation, environment, and development. Most people expressed a preference for removing off-street parking requirements citywide, identifying broad support for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and offering the flexibility to use space previously required for off-street parking for other uses, including more dwelling units, open space, or trees. The next portion of the presentation provides a summary of the proposed land use code amendments, which were included in the agenda materials as attachment B. The next 2 slides will walk through a summary of the proposed code changes. To start, in order to comply with the CFEC rules, we needed to add a new definition and to clarify some other definitions. The main component of the rule changes was to remove minimum off-street parking requirements. Therefore, the majority of the proposed code changes involve removing references to off-street parking minimums and other related requirements. The CFEC rules also require reassessing parking maximums, including those for multi-unit developments. Prior to CFEC, the land use code had parking maximums for non-residential uses, and those maximums were 125% of the minimum parking table calculations. To maintain consistency with prior policy decisions, the draft code applies the 125% calculation for parking maximums citywide for commercial, industrial, and multi-unit residential developments. The amendments also comply with the CFEC rules by requiring preferential parking for carpools and van pools. We also use this opportunity to correct a previous error in the parking dimension table and to modify the applicability section for parking area landscaping to include loading areas and vehicle use areas over 500 square feet in size. The amendments include a new figure that illustrates how to measure surface parking area and parking area landscaping. The amendments add requirements for canopy trees or solar panels for new surface parking lots more than 1/2 acre in size. The amendments also include the EV charging capacity requirements already in effect. Additionally, as prior versions of the code were silent on the locations of EV charging stations, the proposed code would allow charging stations to be located in landscape areas and also in required setbacks if the charging stations are not more than 42 inches in height. The amendments also include the required size limit on total surface parking area for facilities over 65,000 square feet in size. Finally, the amendments retain the option to apply for an adjustment review for maximum off-street parking, but they do modify the approval criteria. Now onto the next steps of the code amendment process. There is another deliberation scheduled for next Tuesday, August 1st, if needed. The Planning Commission can then make a recommendation to the City Council on the proposed parking reform land use code amendments. A City Council public hearing on the code amendments is tentatively scheduled for September. The amendments must be in effect by December 31st, 2023. Otherwise, the CFEC rules require that the city not apply off-street parking minimums citywide as of January 1st, 2024. We'd now be happy to answer any questions that you have about the code amendments or agenda materials. And also I'd like to say that we have Jeff Petrie, who is the curbside and admin services manager here until about 6:15. So if there are any questions about the city's parking management programs, please ask them as soon as possible. Thank you.
Any questions from commissioners?
Well, I can start. I have a lot of questions, as usual. Hopefully they're not too dumb. There are two places, at least two in the draft, page 16 and page 53, where you're talking about surfacing. And I wonder if it's possible for us to require pervious paving instead of statements of concrete. It's page 16, number 2, and page 53, 7A.
We could take that as a recommendation to the council. That would be a pretty big policy shift. Right now, we allow pervious paving in some requirements, especially for stormwater
Yes.
management. There are some limitations in terms of durability of pervious paving. And so we'd have to do a little bit more research to make sure that it would be applicable for all areas.
Well, if we can't include it as the requirement, perhaps it could be included as an option or something. There's something in the statement that just doesn't have to require hard packed concrete or impervious surfaces. At least open the possibility.
Mm-hmm. So to clarify, you were saying to include other options other than just hard concrete and to allow pervious paving options as well?
Yeah.
And I believe the current code does have an allowance if pervious paving surfaces are shown to be of equivalent as other paving services. So right now, if somebody wants to use those portions of the code to, say, for a commercial parking lot or loading area, use some sort of pervious paving option, they need to submit an engineer's report showing that they meet the standards that are needed for that use.
I understand. It's just the way it read to me, it sounded like the concrete was a requirement.
We will take a look at that.
Thank you.
It's an option.
So from your summary in the beginning, I thought we were talking about off-street parking, and a lot of what I read related to on-street parking. And I'm curious if you want to include some of that information in the summary or the introduction, because there was a lot of information about on-street parking, and I didn't know we were looking to deal with that.
And at the last public hearing, there were some questions from commissioners about how those on-street parking programs would go into effect. Say, for instance, if a developer decided to not build off-street parking and there was an overflow effect on streets, what options would neighborhoods have to mitigate that impact? So we brought in Jeff Petrie to answer any questions about that, with the idea being that it's not a part of this code amendment process, but that if this code amendment does create some consequences in neighborhoods, that there would be information about how those neighborhoods would institute a parking management program.
Right, I saw that. There was something else where a lot of on-street parking wording was eliminated, but it included eliminating, where am I, page 20 and 21, 7B and 1B, sentence about calculations. If the parking spaces are not marked, then it has a information about how to calculate. And it seems to me that part of the wording could be left in.
Commissioner Bailing, are you talking about the provisions that allow for, in some neighborhoods, developers to count on-street parking spaces toward their current off-street parking requirements?
I don't have a mastery of the material that well, I'm sorry, but I can tell you it was page 20 and 21, number 7B and number 1B, sub 1B. And I thought, well, we could leave in the reference to how the on-street spaces are calculated.
I unfortunately don't have a copy of the proposed code in front of me, but I'll leave that to Gabe and Reed.
Sure, yeah. I'd be happy to jump in. Gabe Flock, Principal Planner. Good evening, Commissioners. I do believe there are a number of references being stricken from in the proposed code, the draft code that's before you. In the cases where I believe Lauren was referring to, where in a few instances, such as the special Jefferson West Side neighborhood, property owners, developers are allowed to count on-street spaces toward their off-street minimum parking. And so to that end, and based on the removal of the minimum off-street parking requirements, those requirements don't make sense, right? And so those are being sort of eliminated in keeping with the other changes, so that that there is parity and consistency between the two.
Okay. I'd have to reread it, and I can't pull up the agenda. I'm not logged into your Wi-Fi here. Let's see what else.
If I jump in real quick while you kind of regroup a little bit.
Sure.
So I just have a question about process. Still kind of thinking back of the tenure that I've been on the Planning Commission, and I know that I made a kind of a goal of myself to ask the same kind of question every time it comes up. And it's not a critique; it's just a kind of a checking in, a way to learn from previous processes. We had a slide up on the way we engaged the public And it sounded like there was a pretty overwhelming support for the direction that we're going. So I kind of try to look at from the other perspective. So what were some of the critiques that were offered up, and were any changes made on behalf of the critiques that came in that you could highlight?
The main critique was just the concern that the lack of provided off-street parking would result in more of an overflow onto neighborhood streets. And that's why we made sure to include Jeff Petrie in this, and so he can have any sort of conversations about how that would look if a neighborhood did start seeing that impact, how they would go about adding a new off-street or on-street parking management program. Another one that we did get some feedback was on the ADA space situation, because the building code is where the standards for ADA spaces come from. And you only have to provide ADA spaces if you provide parking. So if you don't provide parking, technically the building code does not require ADA spaces, but there is an option underneath the building code, a little carve out that if we were to add a requirement into the land use code to require one ADA space, that would be allowed within the building code. So that's something we highlighted as a potential policy discussion and a decision point in the agenda materials. We have not added that to the code, but it's something that we could look into if there's interest in doing so.
Okay, so in other words, we have not just simply gone out to the public, said this is what we're proposing, gotten feedback and done what we were going to do anyway. The feedback that we got resulted in changes that are ultimately being manifested tonight in the recommendation. Is that correct?
Yeah, we tried to take people's feelings about it and make the code match up as good as possible and within the bounds of the CFAC rule requirements.
Perfect. Thank you. Commissioner Gregola.
Yeah, so my questions were also regarding some of the feedback about ADA and feedback from disability advocates in the community. And so to be clear, we are or are not adding that policy change to this code that would require one ADA parking space, or are you asking for our feedback on doing that?
We're asking for your feedback. There's a number of considerations that we need to be taken into account in order to add that to the draft code. For instance, would we want to exempt certain areas that were already exempt from parking requirements, such as downtown or West University? Because they currently don't have to build parking in those areas. So there's no requirements for ADA spaces. So would we want to exempt certain areas of town? And then also, would we want to exempt smaller lots? Because that's a situation, if we were to require an ADA space, it's not just the one space. There's also backup aisles, space for unloading. So it could potentially create design issues for sites that we're trying to take the most advantage of the space that they have on the site if we are going to require one ADA space. So that would be a couple of policy decisions wrapped up in that overall decision.
Great. Well, I would like to express that I would like to see that policy changed, added. And I would certainly be open to the exemptions that you're recognizing based on staff's expertise.
Any other commissioners? Commissioner Bailing?
Where there's reference to 40% of parking spaces being provided with EV charging stations, was that sourced by us? Is there any connection to a state requirement? Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly out of the state requirement. It actually, requirement went into effect after March 31st. So we have been enforcing it based on the state rules, but we're wanting to put it in the land use code amendments as well. So we have that support from the land use code.
And the way those are set up, can non-EV cars use those parking spaces?
Yeah, we don't really have it written out. What the rule is for charging capacity. So that means when they build a parking lot, they have to lay the cables or the tubes for eventually to run the infrastructure to actually have charging stations. So the assumption would be by the time that there's more electric vehicles on the road and there's that demand for stations, that then they would install the stations, but because the conduit was laid ahead of time, it would be at a lot less expense than if they had to go in and tear up parking lots.
Okay, so it isn't in fact that there has to be 40% stations, there has to be capacity for stations.
That's correct.
Great, thank you. And then something else just from from my university background. There are two places where you talked about 65,000 square feet of floor space, you know, for buildings over 60. And I used to do takeoffs of building space or submittal to the Office of the President of the University of California. And to me, floor area means inside space without walls. And I think your 65,000 square feet, you're actually meaning gross area, gross floor area, but I don't know. And it's not clarified. So I want you to know that that's indistinct. Anybody into architecture, there's a difference between the gross building area versus floor area, which I consider to be inside space without walls.
And yeah, there is a definition in the code presently for floor area, and it is measured from, I believe, the outer walls of the building, but it does add all square footage of a building. So it does include each level of that building in the floor area calculation. So
oh, it was just it wasn't included in the part
exactly, because we didn't change that definition. It's
okay, thanks. I got it.
Any other commissioners?
Good for Neil.
You're off the hook. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay. So before we move on, can I ask a couple of clarifying questions? It appears to me that commission is not ready to take action on a recommendation tonight. Is that accurate? I feel like I've heard from Commissioner Fregler that she is interested in either, maybe you can give me a little bit more clarity, having staff bring back a version of the code that would include the ADA spaces, or potentially just including in the Planning Commission's recommendation adoption of the draft code as written with the addition of a requirement for a single ADA space. And that's what goes to council. But I only heard from Commissioner Fragola on that. So in order for staff to kind of take that step, it would be helpful to hear from if the majority of the commissioners are also interested in that.
Do you want to maybe restate what you're, sorry, Commissioner Beeson?
I guess kind of in response to that, I have a couple of comments. First off, I would support what Commissioner Fragola said, and I think I would support. I feel like I'm kind of ready to go forward tonight if others are, or to look at it. And I think doing it in a way where we would agree that the ADA requirement would be added the way that these guys are talking about it, and we would look at the reasonable exemptions or however that was expressed. I would agree with all that.
Okay.
Having said that, I don't really have a lot of questions. I tried to go through, I usually do. I tried to go through everything in quite a bit of detail, spent time on the findings. I want to say I appreciate what's been done. I know we've had, I guess, 6 meetings by the count that you had in the memo, and the council's had a couple of sessions. I particularly watched those with respect to what the councilors' questions and some of their comments were, so I would kind of have their drift. But I appreciate the work you've done, and also as you put the material together and how it's kind of built on it itself, and started out with a pretty good foundation, and we've just kind of added to it as we've gone. It has felt comfortable to me that we have been on a track to do option 1 for some time. I think that was kind of expressed by a number of people early on. I felt like that's kind of what I heard. And I think when I kind of sorted out, I mean, and maybe this is a bit obvious, but for people who are listening and maybe kind of for the record, when I think about option 1 versus 2 and 3, and I think a number of these things have been talked about over time, but it's pretty clear that option 1 is just kind of the most straightforward. It's going to be the easiest or the least expensive to implement. It's got I don't know that it has any real administrative or regulatory oversight issues. It's certainly less than whatever 2 and 3 would be. One of the things I like a lot, we've been on a track for a couple of years, starting with middle housing, the idea of eliminating barriers to housing in Eugene. And I think this clearly does that in a broad sense. And it kind of frees up land. You mentioned it there's various uses. It can free it up for more housing. It can free it up for more, space in the yard and I kind of like to think of it, not that parking is not a good use, but I kind of think of it myself as maybe being a higher use, freeing up that land and for something other than parking cars. It's as we do it, it's going to enable more. I think it's going to enable more housing than maybe options 2 and 3 would. It's certainly as a step forward for the city, we're going to be able to, I think, provide more affordable housing by making this move. We've never talked a lot about property tax revenues, and I don't propose that we go into it in any depth tonight, but I've all along, whenever I think about providing more housing, it strikes me that within the urban growth boundary, we're probably providing opportunity for more, would seem logical, I guess, more property tax revenue and more revenue to the general fund. So I think all of that's important. I guess the only other thing I just want to kind of emphasize, it follows along for me. Again, I go back to middle housing. It feels like a lot of things sort of started there or begin to really think about some of this stuff. But the idea that housing, we have a lot of important issues, but clearly I think housing and the climate action needs are kind of front and center for a lot of what we're doing. And as you put all this together and as we've talked about it, it's again back to the foundation. It's reinforced with all of the different plans that the city's had in place for a number of years. So I tend to think, I think one could argue that doing this just sort of benefits everybody. And I know there will be people who maybe currently park on a street and things might get a little tighter out on the street. And I wouldn't argue that at all. I think that could happen. But I think overall, we're moving in a direction to encourage people to use alternate modes of transportation in our city. And we recognize the need to become more urban. And there's some efficiencies there, not the least of which is the greenhouse gas saving on those emissions. So I'm going to kind of hold it there. I could sort of go on. I think it's just I like the way that we've approached it over the last year. I think the idea of us kind of hitching our wagon on our own program goals to this state directed work on the CFEC has made a lot of sense. So I'm in support of it, and I'd be ready to support a recommendation to send it on to the council.
Thank you. I'm not really sure where to start with my questions. I've stated many times I've been in clear support of option 1, just as a blanket removing the minimum off-street parking requirements citywide versus trying to do some sort of prescriptive thing and carves out. Where I'm struggling is it's complex, and I'm looking at just now we've added, tree canopy provisions. I have to put my glass on to read all this. All of the other things that in part I think are CFEC, but I don't know that all of them are necessarily derived from CFEC. And so they're kind of all being put into there. I do have a question about what Commissioner Fragala's request about the ADA. Is that every site? requiring an ADA space. So if you have, I'm also confused about where the calculations come in. So you have, that sounded like that was a state, the 1.2, whatever. I don't have it in front of me. Where do those come from? Is that a state thing? And then also when we're moving to maximums, we go from 1 as a minimum to 1.2 or 1.5 to 1.25 as a maximum. I don't understand why. I guess I just have some questions and I didn't really know how we were going to approach this deliberation session here. But to me, there's just like, and I focused on the blue stuff because I thought, you know, that's the stuff that really didn't go out for public input. That wasn't part of the public hearing because we've had these different iterations of the entire code. So I was focusing on what has changed just in since we've been meeting. And so I'm not ready because I just feel like I need to, I mean, I studied through it, but I thought, you know, I've got a lot of questions and maybe it'll all be fleshed out through this process. And I guess I don't even understand in this table what a P and a C means. When I'm looking at employment and industrial zone and land use permit requirements, there's these brand new tables that weren't part of anything before. They're all blue, highlighted blue. And the code and C2 there's a column and it has P, and then there's another column with a C. I don't know what those C's and P's mean.
Same question.
So I apologize. I don't want to be difficult because
No,
I'm super supportive of like making this simple, but then as I look through this, I'm like, this is really complex. And I looked at page by page and I went through and I took lots of little notes, like question mark here and there. And I thought, I just feel like we're adding complexity. And so while I am very supportive of accommodating for disabilities and things like that, I also think that having a requirement for every provision seems like if we don't even have the requirements for the buildings that are being occupied adjacent to the parking, anyway, and I don't know enough about the ADA requirements in buildings, if you're an apartment building or if you're a single family home or whatever else. But to me, requiring parking that's not really consistent with what the structure has to require, to me, that just adds a lot of onerous requirements. So I recognize I just totally, verbally vomited all over, but I need to sit with this a little bit. And I feel like I have a lot more questions and maybe they're like one-on-one style questions or.
I don't think so. I think those are a lot of, so you asked a lot of good questions. And I kind of tried to write them down. And I think between the three of us, we can probably answer most of them. So starting with the ADA space question, I'll turn it over to Reed and Lydia, but my very low level understanding is that currently it's regulated by the building code, and there is a requirement for if you are building off-street parking, so a percentage of that off-street parking has to be ADA accessible. Mm-hmm. So right now, if someone is developing in the city of Eugene and we have a minimum off-street parking requirement for that use, they would have to build, however many spaces that we say they need to build, and a percentage of them would have to be accessible. Once those off-street parking requirements goes away, if someone chose to develop and not build any parking, then there's not a good hook in the building code itself to require them to build an ADA space. But we could include a provision in our land use code that would require the construction of one ADA space, even if they're not constructing any other off-street parking. With the removal of the off-street parking requirements, a developer could still choose to construct off-street parking. And if they do that, then the building code will apply, and that percentage of ADA spaces will need to be constructed. This would only apply in a situation where you have new development, where they're not otherwise building any off-street parking because they're no longer required to do so. And so the question is, under those circumstances, as a policy recommendation, is the Planning Commission interested in amending the land use code to require one ADA space, which is all we can require, or none because no other spaces are being required.
Yeah, I appreciate that, appreciate that, Lauren. And as Commissioner Isaacson mentioned, and Reed responded, the idea for this came out of what we heard in testimony, right? This was one of the issues that people had concerns about. So this was the way that we could address it. We can't require more than one, but we could require one. And so that's why we're bringing it here to you for a policy discussion. I think, and we'd be happy to talk with you more, but I think a lot of the things that you're seeing there are actually CFEC requirements, right? The canopy trees, all of that. There's a lot more that the state rules required than just eliminating off-street parking. There was a lot, as the people who wrote the code know. So for the most part, the things that we're sort of changing, the ADA is one that you could look at. The other is maximum parking. So we currently have maximum, so somebody can't build, 1,000 parking spaces, but and the question is, do you want to continue to have that policy if people choose to build parking to cut it off or not, or just allow that to be, at the option of the developer?
The reason that the table is constructed the way it is, so currently the way that the code is generally set up is to talk about minimum off-street parking requirements. The previous policy direction was to ensure kind of enough off-street parking for the use to concentrate parking off the street rather than on the street. And so we had a table that had all the minimum off-street parking requirements for various uses, and kind of a general statement that the maximum off-street parking would be 125% of the minimum. And so when staff was putting together the code, we translated the minimum table into a maximum table and multiplied each of the minimum requirements by 125%. So if a minimum requirement of 1 space becomes a maximum requirement of 1.25 spaces. So that was a policy decision, and it is something that the Planning Commission could think about doing differently if that's not something that you think makes sense. But there are CFAC requirements about maximum number of parking spaces. And so that was staff's kind of attempt to harmonize the CFAC requirement for having parking maximums with previous city council direction about what those parking maximums should look like in terms of 125% of the minimum.
Yeah.
So that's where that came from.
So let me just say that I feel like 125% sounds fine, except for the fact that what are you supposed to do at 0.25 of a parking space? It doesn't.
There's also language in the code that talks about rounding up and rounding down. So we're only requiring, it's only full spaces. So in the case of a 1.25 requirement, it's actually 2 spaces because you round everything up to the next full.
And why wouldn't we just say that? I don't know. I'm just saying,
Well, because if you have 50 and
Yes,
you have it 1.25 times 50 is a lot different than 2 times.
Okay.
I can speak a little more to that too. So the CFEC requirements had us reassess our maximums, and they had specific rules for how many maximum spaces you could have for multi-unit within the climate-friendly areas, within the proximity to transit corridors. So they did specifically say we had to go in and set maximums in those areas. We, based on previous policy decisions, wanting to do these code amendments citywide, rather than just focusing on those specific areas that the CFEC rules require us to apply these maximums to, did them citywide, and then kept that with the same calculations citywide. Your questions about the use tables specifically, that's a good one too, because those are new because we updated the definition of structured parking. We found out that there was 2 different places in the code that had kind of somewhat conflicting definitions of structured parking. One time it talked about tiers and one time it talked about levels. And we found out after we got the definition clarified so that it was consistent, that there were some tables that were talking about up to 2 levels of structured parking. But the definition is saying 2 or more levels is what you need to be structured parking. So we were including those tables just to show that we are getting rid of the up to two portions so that it's consistent and not confusing or conflicting.
And to answer your specific question, E means outright permitted, C means requires a conditional use permit, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Let me go back really quick to then the Commissioner Fragala's request. So right now in downtown Eugene, we don't have parking requirements. How would an ADA policy, would that basically say we require at least one for every development site?
Well,
Is that what we're talking about?
Reed was talking about
Exemptions.
exemptions, like continuing to exempt downtown and the areas that currently are exempt, because presumably it's been working. And also looking at small lots, for instance, a certain size. So they can develop the whole lot without having to put in one parking space for a relatively small building.
I got a Commissioner Lear.
Yeah.
And apologies to Commissioner Lear, because the hand that when it's up, it's hidden in your fern in the back.
Oh, yeah.
Impossible to see.
Burn me.
So your palm trees are masking you. So please, Commissioner Lear.
Yeah, I think that the ADA question is kind of an interesting one. I guess the first thing I would go to is, what have organizations focused on access said? You know, is there an unmet need, and how is that quantified? Because if there's a genuine need, it's one thing, but it would really be a shame to create and set aside even more parking that's not even going to be used, which in some ways counteracts the underlying purpose of this change. I know we're implementing these state rules to reduce auto use, but also to help resolve what's really a housing shortage crisis. And, you know, I think there's an interesting point that our housing shortage crisis has been caused by underbuilding, and that's been caused by well-meaning policy choices that have kind of collected, that we've made as a city, you know, over the decades and across the state. So I have some kind of complex feelings on that. And I feel like I would also want a little bit more information to feel comfortable recommending that. Backing up generally, I think, at least from my chair, that option one has made the most sense when first presented, and I've heard little to change my mind. I definitely agree with Commissioner Beeson on that. I think that option creates the widest path for more housing, that parking is relatively plentiful in most areas of Eugene. That option two is administratively complex and challenging to implement, if not impossible in some regards, and that the staff and the city have done a great job of understanding how our city feels about it, and that there seems to be clear support for it, especially from those that are affected the most. So with maybe a little caveat to wanting to get more answers on the ADA space requirements, you know, I'd feel pretty strongly in recommending option one to the council based on the information that's been presented so far.
Can I ask a follow-up for Commissioner? So when you say more information, what I heard you start out with was, where does the need come from, right? Is it testimony, or is there some?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm
I don't
not
want to do it just because it's well-meaning, because it's then counteracting the very purpose of what, you know, this legislation was passed for. But if there's, you know, good evidence that it's needed, you know, for people that need ADA access to be able to access where they live, you know, that's a very different story than just, you know, we want to be inclusive, and we want to just kind of throw this out there. So just a little bit more information, if it's available, would be really helpful.
And I could speak a little to that. We had a focus group with some people experiencing disabilities, and they had issues with where we're at currently, just the status quo. There's issues finding off-street ADA spaces that are large enough if they have vans and need that unloading areas. And their concern was that if we do remove minimum parking requirements, then that could just exacerbate the problem. But that wasn't the only problem they identified. They identified sidewalk infrastructure problems, so that even if they're able to take a transit line, they might be able to get within a half mile of their house, but then there's no accessible sidewalks in order to get to the house. So the off-street parking ADA space was one piece that they identified a concern with, but they did have a list of other concerns just about the status quo and the accessibility of our city. Commissioner Park.
Yep, thank you. So I did want to clarify, I am supportive of the ADA parking, but I was by no means expecting it to be applied to everything and everywhere, which is why I included the statement that I would leave it up to the discretion of the staff to identify where it made sense and where it doesn't make sense. That being said, it's my understanding that disability advocate groups and the people that were involved in the focus group have long advocated for increased accessibility around this topic specifically. And in order for our city to be equitably accessible, we would want to, I personally believe we would want to make sure that we apply that standard equitably. So I by no means want it to be required of everything, but I would want it to be across the entire city, right? People who have diverse mobility challenges should be able to live in Bethel as well as downtown, as well as in South Eugene. So I'm interested to see what staff would propose. That being said, I was one of the commissioners that was very intrigued by options 2 and 3. But at this time, I am very much in support of option 1. I do think it's the most equitable approach citywide. And even though it may be quote unquote the most straightforward, I think the thing that I think is important at this time is I think it is an effective use of our community and city resources at a time when the city is facing budget challenges and potential lack of staffing to really implement some of the other strategies. I personally think some of them are bold and forward looking, and I do hope there's a day that our city can consider implementing some of them. I just don't think now is the right time. I also am supportive of option 1 because it removes barriers to housing, and I think it'll be a lot less pavement in our city, which is a good thing. So I want to commend staff for the public feedback process. I thought it was excellent. And I was also really heartened to see the extensive public support indicating values for reducing greenhouse gases. So I am ready to move forward, with the concept of adopting option 1, but I am completely supportive of coming back. I believe we have another deliberation.
So
Scheduled if we want to take a look at the code. I'm also supportive of moving it forward and moving the ADA option as a policy change to city council. So I'm comfortable with either option.
So we could draft a letter from the planning commission about recommending an ADA option to the city council. Is that what you mean by that?
You could do that. I think you could do it as part of the motion as well.
Okay.
So depending on kind of when we finish hearing from planning commissioners, I have a couple of versions of the motion that I think could either kind of more forcefully recommend the addition of the ADA space requirement with some potential carve outs for spaces, or it could be recommend that council consider the addition of the
So I think based on, may I?
No.
Yeah, may I speak? Recent experience around the draft code for the Greenway, I think has demonstrated that the city council really appreciates when we bring very clear recommendations on specific code language and that we have really taken the time to vet the language, that sending them just a recommendation to look at policy, a draft potential something. I don't know if that's great for council based on recent feedback.
So then Commissioner Fago, would it be your hope that staff would bring back potential language for the ADA spaces for your next deliberations?
I think so based on how you just phrased it, and also that there are commissioners that have some concerns.
I think just based on everybody's responses so far, we're clear, we're on option 1. And the real deliberation is on ADA. So maybe staff can come back with something to then approve in our second deliberation to then forward on to council. But a question I had about ADA specifically. So let's use an actual example. We have a building site. The developer wants to put a building on there and maximize the entire space for living quarters. The option we're talking about is minusing off living space to potentially put in one parking space for ADA accessible parking, correct? Why can't the city provide a space in the street parking and into the code that says, if you're going to develop this, we're going to dedicate one street parking for ADA. So we still get the maximum amount of housing. We still get an ADA space that's dedicated for the building project. And if it's an issue of the parking space not being wide enough for a van, you can encroach a little bit into the building space, but not enough that you would need to compromise a whole lot of living space for it.
So I think we did talk about that, and now I want Jeff to come back here.
I saw him leave, and I was looking at the clock.
But and that again could be something we could bring back to you next week. But there are some limitations in terms of using, the public right of way for an ADA space, and depending on what kind of street you're on, you wouldn't want to have somebody exiting, a wheelchair on West 7th, for instance. But that could be something that we look at. I think it is a policy shift, and would be a different way that we would use our public streets.
Just
It also may or may not be part of this code amendment, Commissioner Isaacson. There are part of, I believe we started to look at this. I'm not sure how far down the road staff got, but there are things that we can require in the land use code, but typically, if you're talking about an improvement to a street that's already public, that is a different process than your kind of regular development application. It may not even live in Chapter 9. It may live in a different portion of the code. And so I don't know that would be encompassed in these code amendments, although that could, again, be a recommendation from Planning Commission that council consider that idea and how that would work.
I don't think there's any one brush that covers every scenario. And that's kind of what I liked about the discussion so far, in that we're allowing staff to have multiple tools in their tool belt for a given development, that we are not recommending, and that the council's not adopting a one size fits all and hope that everybody's 80% satisfied. That you have, depending on whatever the particulars of the development, staff has a number of different options to kind of pull from, with the idea that housing is the biggest driver here. How can we accommodate the folks that need accommodating, at the same time maximizing the housing, given the options that we have on the table? And Planning Commission's recommendation is putting forth those ideas. I think that's the pathway for me. But I'm done, Commissioner Bees.
So I wanted to express agreement with what Commissioner Fragala said, and what I thought Lauren was saying. Maybe just to clarify, if I'm up with it here, I know I'm definitely ready to go ahead, but if everybody's not, I think it's fine to come back next week and talk about this some more and get more questions answered. Assuming we do that, I'm thinking, and maybe this was kind of said, but I think it would be good if staff drafted up what you think we ought to do with respect to the ADA, given the discussion we've had, and embed it in the draft code. And I'm again following along with what Commissioner Fragala said. I think the council would appreciate it more if we have the detailed code. And I may be conflicting with a few other things that were said. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that would, to me, be a pretty good way to approach it. I think we've kind of heard people generally agree we ought to incorporate something about it. We ought to have some exceptions to it. And so that's, I guess, kind of my suggestion.
Commissioner Lear, your hand again was hidden.
In the palm tree.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. So just, I'm trying to pay attention and find this in the draft code as well. Is there a minimum development size for a multifamily building where the ADA space would kick in? I mean, would this therefore be quite required at every triplex and fourplex to have one space that's ADA? Can I get just a little bit more explanation on that?
Yeah, it's not currently required, but that would be one of the, could be the exceptions that we would look at, right? In terms of, we wouldn't require an ADA space for single family dwelling, or maybe not for a triplex, but
where would we require it? I mean, what's the idea then if we're talking about including this in a recommendation? What do you recommend?
And that's a bit of the challenge and why we didn't put anything in there, because there's a lot of different variety for that. So for instance, another municipality, they exempted their downtown corridor from the ADA space requirement, and they exempted any lots less than 20,000 square feet from the ADA space requirement. We could also look at specific use types, like exempting middle housing, if that's going to be a concern. Could only apply it to multi-unit housing that typically would build plenty of parking. We could really choose how we want to. The only caveat being that we can only require that one space. So
it seems like it's very preliminary then at this point, and without the ability to quantify the need, I just wouldn't want to hold up the rest of this. It seems like we're early on in understanding what this need is.
Commissioner Edwards.
I would like to agree with Commissioner Lear. I believe that this is a much more complex issue, and that we're trying to attach something to this one policy. And we talked about sidewalks being an issue. And I think accessibility is a bigger issue than something you can just, throw some policy around parking and think that we can solve that problem. And like, as Commissioner Lear mentioned, I don't know that we really understand the true need. And so to have all of these parking spaces to be unused, that's actually creates a different problem. So I don't think that I mean, this is my opinion, but I don't think that piece of it is something that I would suggest us move forward with. I'm comfortable with, the base decision tonight. I think that the other conversation, I think that if there's a way that we can convey to council that this work needs to be done, and we're willing to dive into this work and incorporate it into different places in our land use policies and whatnot. But I just don't think that this belongs just as an add-on to a parking policy. I think we've too much we don't know. So that's all.
Commissioner Beasley.
Yeah, I just, it seems to me, just respectfully, it seems to me that we ought to put something in the code regarding this. I feel like staff, in terms of the complexity and the detail and all the ramifications in the code and all the things that it might connect to, are best able to draft something up. I feel like if we put it in a recommendation accompanying what we send to the council, we're kind of kicking the can down the road a bit. We're basically, I mean, at some point, it seems like if we're going to have something in the land use code around what we're talking about, somebody's going to have to write it, or they're going to have to draft it. And I kind of leave it at that. I guess I'm trying to promote the idea that maybe we draft it at this time, we incorporate it in the code we send to the council.
May I interject myself for just a minute and ask a clarifying question of Reed and Lydia? So is my understanding correct, and it may not be, that if even once minimum parking requirements are removed from the code, so nobody has to build any off-street parking, if someone chooses to build off-street parking, the building code would apply, and they would need then that requirement for a percentage of ADA accessible spaces would kick in. Okay, so even if option one was adopted, or if the code was adopted exactly as it stands now, if someone chose to build parking, then the ADA requirement kicks in, and some portion of them have to be ADA accessible. It would only be if someone didn't choose to build off-street parking, and therefore the ADA requirement wouldn't automatically kick in. So we're only talking about that universe of folks who didn't choose to build off-street parking. We could say no, even if you don't choose to build any other off-street parking, you must build one ADA accessible space. So that's if it's a, your typical multifamily development or large commercial development where they are likely going to choose to build parking because that's what their customer base would want, they will need to make some of those spaces ADA accessible. Okay, I wanted to clarify that for myself. Thank you.
So I just want to say I'm in agreement with some provision, including ADA requirement. I understand what Lauren is saying. It's just a very small example. It would only be if a development is choosing not to build parking. But I think it's important. And it, for me, goes back in part to the very beginning of the statement that the purpose of the whole CFEC work is to be more inclusive and perhaps some attention to populations that have not been treated equitably. And I want to keep that in mind as a priority. I think it's very important. I also can go on record supporting option one. That's fine. I think you all have done a remarkable job putting this together. I envisioned many sleepless nights, so thank you for all of your hard work. Yeah, and I think that's it. I think it's important.
So I guess my question for staff would be, do you think with the questions that you've gotten from us that you could come back with two options as relates to ADA, comprising all the different aspects that we've come up with for us to look at, and have it be three options, the two that you've promoted or none at all? And you have enough to be able to present to us, because I get that there's a lot of variables, and the variables from this perspective make us go, this isn't fleshed out. But I think that I trust you guys to be able to tell us, we can come back to you with a recommendation, or we are not anywhere near being able to do that in a way that is 30 years in the future. Because we're not, the decisions we're making now, a development's going to be there for 30 years or 40 years or however long, right? So I would trust you guys to tell us where you guys are at. And can you do that?
Yeah, I think we can come up with a couple ideas. This hasn't been studied in depth. The implications of requiring an ADA space when no other parking is required or provided. We don't 100% know what those would mean. Like you said earlier, it could be a situation where if, say, we have an exemption of a 20,000 square foot lot or something like that, and it's just over 20,000 square foot and they really want to build out the whole site, there could be a situation where that means that there's fewer dwelling units built because of the ADA space requirement. So happy to come up with some ideas for code. I don't know if we can make well thought out recommendations that that's going to be the appropriate solution for a code, but we can definitely come up with some options for consideration next week.
So what I will say is, no, we can't come up with options, but we can come up with a draft code for your consideration. And we can point out the places where staff made policy decisions, like, not requiring 4 lots under 20,000 square feet, exempting middle housing, exempting da-da-da. And then planning commission can give staff feedback, because if you're happy with what staff has drafted, you can move that forward to council in that deliberations, and we can keep on the timeline. If you're not happy with what staff has drafted and you want additional deliberations or to make additional decisions, that will require redrafting. And so we would need another meeting. Bringing you options will also require more drafting, so we would need another meeting. So the thing that we can do to kind of keep us on our current timeline is to bring you a new version of the code that includes ADA requirements, but points out where staff decided, made what is essentially a policy decision. We can talk about why, and then planning commission can tell us whether or not you agree with that or would like to see something different.
Commissioner Edwards?
But I would.
I have a quick question and a comment. ADA parking requirements, I imagine they're different than a regular parking space, right? So taking up more space, I don't know if there's a standard, but So if we're not, we go from not requiring anything right now unless someone chooses to build parking to requiring something that is presumably more space. I guess I'm kind of trying to figure out what that would look like, but in my absence next week, because I won't be here, I'd like to just express my support for option one. You all would have to make the rest of those decisions. So I just wanted to put that out there that I'd like to, if there was a way to parse out those decisions and be able to vote on the draft, but it sounds like you guys want to work on some other things, so.
Commissioner Franklin.
I wanted to say that I would like to stay on our timeline. So, you know, we do have one more meeting for deliberations. I think you have a strong sense of support for option one from the commission at this point. And what I am interested in seeing what we can do in this area. Though I'm not 100% wedded to it. So I hope that doesn't feel like I'm asking you to do work that I might then be like, no, I don't need it. But you know, in the example that you give, Lauren, like, even if we had a multifamily development that was going to build, if deciding to do this resulted in even one multifamily house development, who was not going to do any parking, had to provide one ADA unit, I think that is a reasonable outcome for having an equitable community that is accessible to people of all types of mobilities. That being said, I would not want it to apply to middle housing. I think you probably have a sense of, you know, where this commission wants to go in terms of not hamstringing some of the creativity in housing development that we've made an effort to support. So. And I wanted to express my interest in supporting our sticking to timeline.
One of the things that, just for your consideration, and again, we can talk more about this next week, that staff has discussed is, you know, building one parking space, as Reed said, requires, you know, a drive aisle and a backup space. And so I think there, it may be worth thinking about if requiring an ADA space will trigger a developer providing more parking. And maybe that's fine, right? Maybe they'll end up providing 3 spaces or 5 spaces because, you know, they've started to put in that infrastructure. So just something for your consideration. And again, we can talk about that a little bit more. We don't know, but I mean, that just makes sense. Pardon?
Would that butt up against the maximums though?
So the ADA spaces are exempted from the definition of off-street parking spaces.
Right.
So therefore the CFEC requirements don't actually cover the requirement to have that one ADA space. So if we required one ADA space and then the developer decided, okay, since I have to have all this maneuvering space that's off-street because you can't back up into the right of way, then they might look at that and be like, okay, I can throw in a couple more parking spaces. And that would be their decision to do so. That wouldn't be something that the city would be requiring at that point. We would just be requiring the one ADA space, which then might have additional requirements just for the rest of the code.
And I understand your question, Commissioner Edwards. Would those additional spaces then run afoul of the new parking maximums? And that would depend on the use and how many spaces were allowed based on the use and the size of the lot and all that stuff.
But those new spaces would be held to the same standard in terms of, like, say, the new conduit that has to be put down, 40% of them would have to, right? So
Right.
to add that one space, if someone said, oh, well, I'm already adding this extra space here, I might as well add 3 additional ones. Now I've got all the cost of burying the conduit. I've got all that stuff that goes along with it. So again, if staff can think about what ways we can either in our recommendation to council to look at all the tools in the toolbox, even if it's the 88 spot that the city's going to dedicate from street parking, it has to be within 2 blocks of the proposed development. Whatever you want to come back to the table with, if it's a choice between sacrificing, you know, one whole space of housing 3 stories high. So I'm losing 3 houses for one ADA space at the expense of not putting something in the tool belt that still gets the same thing accomplished just by moving it 10 feet over. I would want to see that. That should be.
And we can also talk to you more about some of those requirements, like I can defer to Reed for conduit, but the tree canopy requirements or the solar requirement, those only kick in for very large lots. So a parking lot of more than half acre, that's not a couple extra spaces because somebody had to put in an ADA space. So just to kind of think about how those things fit together or not.
Commissioner Lear.
Yeah, and hearing some of these discussions and fleshing that out a little bit, I do still struggle to see how we're going to answer this question definitively in another week, of kind of spitballing. To me, I just think it makes more sense to break this issue off and consider it, in the larger context, because that point was really well made that if you're going to now have to sacrifice a significant amount of footprint in order to build this space, well, why not just build 4 more and cut into it a little bit further? It seems like there's a lot of possibility for unintended consequences and to kind of counteract the basic point of this.
I do want to just dovetail what I just said. That to me, that doesn't mean that, housing is the ultimate lens we look through. I mean, much like the Greenway, we can build all the houses we want. We could build all over the entire Greenway, but at some point people have to live here, right? So how are we making the environment, the city, fair and equitable and in a place that's welcoming and inviting? So, it's a balance, and I'm looking to staff to do that. So I don't envy your job in the next week, but I'm looking forward to what you have come up with.
So I will say to you that because we do need to do some code drafting between now and next meeting, it may be that your packet comes to you a little later than we would otherwise like. So it might be a Friday or possibly even a Monday packet, but we will do our best to really highlight the changes so they're easy to see.
Commissioner Bailey.
I just wanted to mention that developers and architects tend to be, I think, pretty creative. And there may be opportunities here that we haven't thought of. There could be 2 areas, 2 buildings, and they do one shared ADA space. There are solutions. We don't have to come up with all the solutions, I'm thinking. We just need to clarify what our base requirement will be, keeping in mind the need for equitably addressing the needs of the public. Thank you.
Any other comments from commissioners? Okay, then the next is any questions or comments from staff. Next items, you want new agenda items?
You guys. I guess just as a quick, I'll just do a quick wrap up. So I feel like I heard direction from at least 4 of the 6 commissioners here today that they are interested in looking at code drafted by staff that would require an ADA space for uses, not all uses, with some exemptions, that would not otherwise choose to build off-street parking. And so we will put that together. We will bring back a proposal next for the next deliberations on the 1st, which is next Tuesday. And Planning Commission can look at it and see what you think. And you then at that point do have the opportunity to say, actually, no, this is more complicated than we thought. We're not ready to make some of these policy calls, or, yep, this is what we wanted and we're ready to forward that to council. So we will bring back that option, and then you still have the opportunity to decide whether or not to take it up.
So those are the 2 options. Either like what staff comes back with is what the count. I mean, I'm just timeline as a factor there. If there's a completely new thing, something on the table for a planning commission to vote on, and everyone who's here to vote on it can't all get on the same page, do we have to go back to the drawing board again, or can we revert back to like what we have in front of us today?
Yeah.
And say, let's just go with that, because the rest of it is clearly more complicated and it involves more than just parking spaces. It's sidewalks, it's this. So I guess I just want to clarify that we aren't gonna go down a rabbit hole because we now have a new option that we have to put before.
That's a fair question, Commissioner Edwards, and I'm sorry if I wasn't.
No, that's okay.
That, yes, Planning Commission has many options, and your recommendation is your recommendation. So Planning Commission could decide, once they've seen staff's proposal, it's great, let's incorporate it as part of the recommendation. Planning Commission could decide, nope, it's too much, we're not really on board, and then because of the timeline, we're just gonna put that aside or send it to council as a recommendation for consideration as part of a different action. And we're going to recommend moving forward with option 1. You have lots of options.
Which is why I reiterated my commitment to the timeline.
Thank you. I think I have what I need, hopefully.
And it's fine. Our feelings will not be hurt if you decide that you want to just stick with option 1. That will be fine.
I think we're ready to move forward. New items or from staff or new.
Okay. I can move on beyond parking, although actually your next meeting is next Tuesday again, and that will be to wrap up your parking deliberations and make a recommendation to council. Your next meeting after that is on the 15th, and that is a public hearing and possible action on a code amendment related to Skinner Butte height limit. This is a site-specific code amendment, so I just want to remind you that makes it quasi-judicial, not legislative. So try to avoid any conversations about that one outside of your deliberations. And then right now on the calendar, we have both the 22nd and the 29th being held for possible deliberations. As we get closer to that, we'll let you know. We're still, the MIMS houses zone change is still floating out there. And then it also depends what happens at your hearing on the 15th. So hopeful we can at least trim that down to 1 meeting instead of 2. And then just in case you didn't know, the Willamette River Greenway Code Amendments were passed by council unanimously on July 12th. So that was an 8-0 vote. So thank you. They were very complimentary of your work, and that was outstanding. That's awesome. Council is on break. Yes, starting, what day is it? Thursday. Starting on Thursday until early September. So that's kind of a relief for a lot of us in a sense. Because there's less meetings, not any other reason. Less AISs to review. And maybe just me, maybe I'm just the one that's relieved. And then just also, we're kind of still working on what your September and October are going to look like. Some potential public hearings coming up. We're working on where River Road is going to fit in with that joint public hearing, and just some other items. Also, typically in September or October, we do elections for a new chair and vice chair. So be thinking about that. And then we did not have a retreat last year, so it will be 2 years, I think, this fall. So we'll be looking to schedule a retreat sometime this fall as well. And I think that's all I have on my list.
Any additional things from commissioners before we adjourn? Commissioner Beeson.
With respect to the retreat, I've been thinking about it for a bit. I guess this is kind of a proposal, but I think I'll toss this out and see what people think. I'm a strong believer in groups like this, periodically spending some time and kind of convening and talking about how we work together and what we do. I was kind of reminded of that as I started my 2nd term. I got a packet from the city manager's office that included some suggestions to boards and commissions about how the city likes to do some of these and what they think are good ideas and so on. And one of the things in there that was pretty prominent is that if you're in a group like this, it's good at once in a while to set aside some time. So I don't probably need to spend a lot of time maybe convincing people, what I've been struck with is we haven't been able to get one together. And I'm thinking, I think that when we try to do it, staff is looking to find a time when all 7 of us are able to make a meeting. And I think that's proven to be difficult for some reason. We're just not able to do it. I guess my suggestion would be that, and what I personally would be comfortable with, I think the idea of having something like this maybe once a year is a good idea. I think if we did it for, say, a 2-hour period in a regular meeting, I think that would be pretty good opportunity for us to spend some time in some kind of self-governance, if you will. It would be fine with me if the chair and the vice chair, talking with the planning director, came up with some kind of agenda and said, you know, here's 4 or 5 things that we might consider talking about how we work together. You could float that by the commission, but I would probably just schedule it on one of our Tuesday nights. And if we have a quorum, we should have a session and handle it just like a meeting. I think it's ultimately more important that we periodically do something like this than never do it, because we can't find time that, you know, a night all 7 of us can do it. So I don't know that I'm not really making a motion, or I'm just kind of tossing it out. And I mean, if people are interested, I'd be comfortable. I think we ought to push forward and try to set up a little more intentionally and set up a retreat. So.
Well, can I ask, what is intended as the purpose, Allison, of a retreat? And who all's included? Is it just us, or is it also the planning department people, or who?
Yeah, there's a lot to that
Who is
question.
included?
Yeah, that's fair.
And what is the purpose of it? And I had assumed, since it said retreat, that it would be some kind of more informal getting together of.
Lauren, do you want to maybe talk about what it's been like the past? Because
Yeah.
I've never been to one from a planning commission.
I'll go ahead and do that. So as much as we would like to keep it really casual and informal, it will still be a public meeting. And
It would?
yes, because it's a quorum of you.
Oh.
And so we still have to follow public meeting laws and notice it. And so it's probably not going to be as informal as you would want it to be. Doesn't necessarily have to look like this, however. And, you know, they've been designed differently throughout the years. It's definitely, you know, we try as hard as we can to get all the planning commissioners, planning director, and then at least our 2 section managers of long range and current planning at a minimum. Sometimes we add more staff. They're usually kind of a little bit of getting to know you. There's, you know, operating procedures. Sometimes there's legal training. Sometimes it's, actually, the last one, that's actually what came out of there. I think there was a catch-all, I'm losing my words here, but this is where the land acknowledgement statement came out of, because that was something that Commissioner Ramey was interested in talking about at the retreat. And so that is something that came out of there. We typically solicit for topics from the group.
And they were half day or full day? Or
I think the most we've done is like 4 hours.
4 hours?
Yeah.
So think of it like team building and professional development.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a good
great.
summary.
It wasn't televised. I mean, it wasn't closed circuit, right? I mean.
I think we recorded the Zoom.
Oh, so I'm thinking of it one before Zoom was even.
When we were at the
Okay.
library.
Yeah, so right, when we were in the library, but if anybody had wanted to attend.
Right, they were
Yeah.
welcome to come,
Yeah.
and it wasn't something they could go back and watch it. It wasn't recorded. It was just, it changed the whole tone, I felt like.
And there are, Commissioner Edwards, during the pandemic, public meetings requirements changed a little bit. So that the way that we used to structure those meetings may not be possible anymore. But Alyssa and I always kind of talk about options and.
Yeah, I mean, we do want it to be as comfortable as possible and, you know, allow for those discussions that don't feel so metered and meet the public meeting law.
Yeah.
I think our ideal retreat should be one of those escape rooms where we have to design code to something effectively.
Okay, I might need some help designing that.
Sorry, we might be diverging.
I recognize that, well, I've been to two of them. I recognize that we have, you know, staff has a lot to do. And so when we set up almost anything, it requires staff time. I really want to kind of reemphasize, I would be personally comfortable with the chair and the vice chair and the planning director putting together some subject matter for a few hour discussion. And I guess the other thing I really kind of just want to push on one last time. I think the idea is maybe we ought to just give it a try and just do something. I think spending a bit of time, I've said it, but I think spending a bit of time, at least once a year, in a group that meets on a regular basis and we all kind of know each other, talking about our process is pretty healthy. It's a pretty good thing for the city. It's a good thing for us. And so I would push on it a bit. That's it. That's all.
I think maybe at our next briefing, before the next meeting, we can start that conversation about kind of when and how and what. Cool. Thank you.
I think we're ready to adjourn. Thank you. This meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission is now adjourned.